Next up, we have from Grimm's Fairy Tales a very famous story, Rapunzel. But this is the very first telling of the story of Rapunzel, so it's a little different, but it's where all the movies and stories you've heard about Rapunzel came from. So, Rapunzel. Once upon a time, there lived a husband and a wife who had been wishing for a child for many years. But it had all been in vain. Finally, though, the woman became pregnant. Now, in the back of their house, the couple had a small window that overlooked a fairy's garden, filled with all kinds of flowers and herbs. But nobody ever dared enter it. One day, however, when the wife was standing at the window and looking down into the garden, she noticed a bed of wonderful Rapunzel. She had a great craving to eat some of that lettuce, and yet she knew she couldn't get any. So she began to waste away and look wretched. Her husband eventually became horrified and asked what was ailing her. "If I don't get any of that Rapunzel from the garden behind our house, I shall have to die." Her husband loved her very much and thought, "No matter what it costs, you're going to get some Rapunzel." So one evening he quickly climbed over the high wall into the garden, grabbed a handful of Rapunzel, and brought the lettuce to his wife. Then she immediately made a salad and ate it with great zest. However, the Rapunzel tasted so good to her, so very good, that her craving for it became 3 times greater the next day. Her husband knew that if she ever was to be satisfied, he had to climb into the garden once more. And so he went over the wall into the garden, but he was extremely terrified when he stood face to face with the fairy, who angrily berated him for daring to come into that garden and steal her Rapunzel. He excused himself as best he could by explaining that his wife was pregnant and that it had become too dangerous to deny her Rapunzel. "All right," the fairy finally spoke. "I shall permit you to take as much Rapunzel as you like, but only if you give me the child that your wife is carrying." In his fear, the man agreed to everything, and when his wife gave birth, the fairy appeared at once, named the baby girl Rapunzel, and took her away. Rapunzel grew to be the most beautiful child under the sun, but when she turned 12, the fairy locked her in a very high tower that had neither doors nor stairs, only a little window high above. Whenever the fairy wanted to enter the tower, she would stand below and call out, "Rapunzel! Rapunzel! Let down your hair!" Rapunzel had radiant hair, as fine as spun gold. Each time she heard the fairy's voice, she unpinned her braids and wound them around a hook in the window. Then she let her hair drop 20 yards, and the fairy would climb up on it. One day, a young prince went riding through the forest and came upon the tower. He looked up, and he saw beautiful Rapunzel at the window. When he heard her singing with such a sweet voice, he fell completely in love with her. However, since there were no doors in the tower and no ladder could ever reach her high window, he fell into despair. Nevertheless, he went to the forest every day until one time he saw the fairy, who called out, "Rapunzel! Rapunzel! Let down your hair!" As a result, he now knew what kind of ladder he needed to climb up into that tower. He took careful note of the words he had to say, and the next day at dusk, he went to the tower and he called out, "Rapunzel! Rapunzel! Let down your hair!" So she let her hair drop, and when her braids were at the bottom of the tower, he tied them around him, and she pulled him up. At first, Rapunzel was terribly afraid, but soon the young prince pleased her so much that she agreed to see him every day and to pull him up into the tower. Thus, For a while, they had a merry time and enjoyed each other's company. The fairy didn't become aware of this until one day when Rapunzel began talking and said to her, "Tell me, Mother Gothel, why are my clothes becoming too tight? They don't fit me anymore." "Oh, you godless child," the fairy replied. "What's this I hear?" And she immediately realized that she had been betrayed, and she became furious. Then she grabbed Rapunzel's beautiful hair, wrapped it around her left hand a few times, picked up a pair of scissors with her right hand, and snip, snap, the hair was cut off. Afterward, the fairy banished Rapunzel to a desolate land where she had to live in great misery. In the course of time, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. On the same day that the fairy had banished Rapunzel, she fastened the braids that she had cut off to the hook of the window, and that evening, when the prince came and called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," she let the braids down. But when the prince climbed up the tower, he was astonished to find the fairy instead of Rapunzel. "Do you know what, you villain?" the angry fairy said. "Rapunzel is lost to you forever." In his despair, the prince threw himself from the tower. He escaped with his life, but he lost both eyes. Sadly, he wandered around the forest, eating nothing but grass and roots, and did nothing but weep. Some years later, he finally made his way to the desolate land where Rapunzel was leading a wretched existence with the children. When he heard her voice, it sounded familiar at first, and then he immediately recognized it. She recognized him too, and embraced him. Two of her tears fell upon his eyes, and then his eyes became clear again, and he could see, as usual. And that's the end.